My daughter showed up at my door at 4 a.m. No coat, no shoes, her body in severe hypothermia after walking more than 2 kilometers through the forest in the dark at 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 7 degrees Celsius. Her husband, the man I once called my son-in-law, said it was just a small misunderstanding. But when the police arrived, he immediately shifted all the blame onto me. This controlling, obsessive father-in-law is the real problem. I said nothing. I just let him finish, then played the one thing he thought had been buried forever. I truly appreciate you being here with me right now. Before we continue, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Also, please note, this story may include some fictional elements added for reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or places could be coincidental, but the message behind it is worth hearing and thinking about. I have lived alone long enough to know the difference between the sounds a house makes at night and the sounds that mean something is wrong. The pine beams settle after midnight when the temperature drops. The propane heater clicks on every 40 minutes or so, a sound so familiar I stopped hearing it years ago. The wind off the Cascade Range rattles the storm windows in a rhythm I could map with my eyes closed. After 11 years in this cabin on the western edge of Bend, Oregon, I knew every sound this place made, the way you know the breathing of someone you love. So when the knocking started at 4 in the morning, I was already sitting up before I was fully awake. It was not the wind. It was not the pipes. It was a fist against wood, uneven and desperate, the kind of sound that carries weight behind it. I swung my legs off the bed and reached for the lamp on the nightstand. The clock read 4:02. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snow that had been falling since sundown was now pressing against the windows in thick, muffled silence. I am 62 years old. I spent 30 years as an insurance investigator, which is a polite way of saying I was paid to notice things other people missed. I learned early in that career that the middle of the night only delivers 2 kinds of visitors, the ones who are lost and the ones who are desperate. The knocking told me this was the second kind. I pulled on my boots without lacing them and crossed the living room in the dark. My hand found the porch light switch out of habit. I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle, and opened the door. The cold hit me first, a wall of it, sharp and immediate. Then I saw her. My daughter Calla was standing on the porch steps with snow up to her shins. She was 29 years old, and she had walked through a pine forest in the dark to get to my door, and it showed in every inch of her. Her lips had gone the color of a deep bruise. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not hold them still, and she was wearing a thin blouse that belonged at a dinner party, not in a November storm. She had no coat. She had no gloves. Her hair was matted with melting snow, and her eyes, when they finally found mine, held the particular blankness of someone who had burned through every last reserve they had just to make it this far. I did not ask questions. I pulled her inside. The investigator in me and the father in me moved at the same time, which is something I have learned to stop fighting over the years. I sat her on the couch closest to the propane heater and reached for the wool blankets I keep folded on the armchair. I wrapped the first one around her shoulders and the second around her feet, which were soaked through her shoes. I ran my hands along her arms, checking for feeling, watching her face for responses. Her skin was cold in a way that went deeper than surface, that particular coldness that settles into the tissue when the body has been fighting the elements for too long. I grabbed my phone off the side table and called 911, and I kept talking to Calla while the line connected. I told her she was safe. I told her she was inside. I told her the heater was on and I was right here. The dispatcher answered, and I gave them the address. 224 Ridgeline Road, West Bend, told them I had a woman in her late 20s showing signs of severe cold exposure, and asked them to send an ambulance. Then I put the phone on speaker, set it on the coffee table, and kept working. I went to the kitchen and filled a mug with warm water from the tap. Not hot. 30 years of reading accident reports had taught me that warming someone too fast after extreme cold exposure can send shock through the system. warm and slow. I brought the mug back and wrapped her hands around it, keeping my own hands over hers, until I felt her grip tighten slightly. That was something. That meant her body was still fighting. The dispatcher was asking me questions, and I answered them without looking away from Calla. Breathing yes. Responsive partially. Frostbite checking now. I lifted the hem of her soaked shoes and looked at her feet. The skin was pale and waxy where it should have been pink. I covered them back up and tucked the blanket tighter. The ambulance would be 12 minutes out from the nearest station, on the east side of town, the dispatcher told me. I said, understood, and kept my hands moving, kept my voice steady, kept watching her face for color returning. It was when I was checking her hands for circulation that I saw them. I have been in this line of work long enough to know what cold does to skin and what branches do when you push through underbrush in the dark. I know those marks. I know the way they present ragged and shallow, the specific pattern of someone fighting their way through dense forest cover. Calla had some of those. Her palms were scraped, and her left forearm had a long, shallow cut below the elbow that was consistent with a branch strike. But there were other marks. Older ones. Marks on the inside of her wrists and along the backs of her hands that had nothing to do with pine trees or frozen ground. These were faded at the edges in the particular way that meant they had not happened tonight. They had happened before tonight more than once, with enough time in between for the skin to start the long process of trying to forget. I looked at them for a long moment. The heater clicked on. Outside somewhere in the distance, I could hear the first thin wail of a siren moving through the snow. My daughter was staring at the ceiling with those empty eyes, and I pulled the blanket a little tighter around her without saying a word. 30 years of investigating taught me that the moment you think you are looking at the beginning of a story is almost never the actual beginning. There is always something that came before, a chain of small decisions, small silences, small surrenders, that nobody thought to document until the night someone ended up on a porch in the snow. I had found the end of that chain. Now I needed to find where it started. She told me the story in pieces over the next hour while the ambulance was on its way, and the heater worked steadily against the cold pressing in from outside. I sat beside her on the couch, and I listened the way I had trained myself to listen over 3 decades of pulling the truth out of situations that did not want to give it up, without interrupting, without reacting, just taking it in, filing it, letting the picture build itself one detail at a time. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, sitting still and listening to my daughter tell me where she had been. This is what she told me. The evening had started as a party. Her husband, a real estate developer named Beckett Crane, had been planning the event for weeks. He was launching a new residential project on the south side of Bend, the kind of upscale development that had been spreading across Central Oregon as more people discovered what locals had always known about this place. 20 or 30 guests were expected. Business partners, contractors, a few people from the city planning office. The kind of crowd Beckett cultivated carefully, the kind that made him look exactly the way he wanted to look. Calla had spent the afternoon getting the house ready. She had not been invited to have an opinion about the menu or the guest list, but she had set out the glasses and arranged the appetizers and made sure everything was the way he wanted it. They had argued before the first guest arrived. She could not tell me exactly what started it, because the truth was that arguments with Beckett rarely had a clear beginning. They had a temperature that rose gradually until something small became the reason everything boiled over. He told her she needed some air. He said it the way he said most things, quietly and with a certainty that did not leave room for negotiation. She stepped outside onto the back porch to give him what he asked for. The door locked behind her. At first she thought it was an accident. The smart lock system Beckett had installed 6 months earlier was connected to an app on his phone, and he had changed the entry code twice already since setting it up. She knocked on the glass panel beside the door. Inside, she could see the party in full motion, guests moving through the lit rooms with drinks in hand, the low sound of conversation, and music audible even through the insulated glass. Nobody turned around. She went around to the front door and tried the code she knew. It did not work. She tried it again, then again. The keypad blinked red each time, patient and indifferent. She called his number. It rang through to voicemail. She tried twice more. Nothing. She looked at her contact list for someone nearby, a neighbor, anyone. She had lived in that house for nearly 2 years, and she knew almost none of her neighbors by name because Beckett preferred it that way. She found 2 numbers for people on their street and called both of them. One did not answer. One picked up, heard her voice, and said they did not want to get involved in whatever was happening. The temperature that night was 19 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. She scrolled for my number. This is the part of the story that sat in my chest like a stone when she told me because my number was not there. It had been removed from her contacts 2 months earlier. She had not noticed until that moment, standing outside in the cold, with 4% battery remaining on her phone, because for 2 months, there had always been some reason not to call me, some conflict that conveniently arose whenever she thought about reaching out. She did not have my number memorized. Why would she? It had always just been there. She told me she stood at the edge of the driveway for a few minutes trying to think. The snow was coming down steadily by then. She was wearing the blouse she had put on for the party, thin fabric, that had been perfectly appropriate an hour ago inside a heated house. She had no coat because she had only stepped outside for a moment. That was all it was supposed to be. She knew the forest behind the development. Not well, not the way she had known it as a girl, but enough. When she was young, before everything, I used to walk the Ponderosa pine trails on the west side of town with her on Saturday mornings. She knew the general direction. She knew that if she kept the slope of the terrain to her left and moved toward lower ground, she would eventually come out somewhere near Ridgeline Road. She knew my cabin was 1.4 miles as the crow flies through the trees. She turned off her phone to save the last of the battery, tucked it into her blouse pocket, and walked into the forest. She told me she did not let herself stop. She had read somewhere years ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in extreme cold is to sit down and rest, because the body's warmth goes with the movement, and once it leaves, it is very difficult to call back. So she kept moving. When she fell, she got up. When a branch caught her hand and opened a line across her palm, she pressed it against her side and kept walking. When her feet went from painful to numb, she focused on her knees instead, on the mechanical lifting and placing of each step. The trees at night in a snowstorm are not quiet the way people imagine. The wind moves through the upper branches in a continuous low sound that is almost like breathing, and the snow falls in the kind of silence that has weight to it. She told me she talked to herself for a while just to hear a voice. Then she saved her breath for walking. Her phone died somewhere around the half-mile mark. After that, there was nothing but the forest and the dark and the direction she had chosen to trust. She told me that when she finally saw the light from my cabin through the trees, just the faint, warm glow of the porch lamp cutting through the snow, she stopped walking for the first time. She stood there in the dark, with the cold pressing in from all sides. And she told me she genuinely could not tell in that moment whether the light was real or whether her mind had simply decided to give her something to walk toward. The light had been real. She had made it to my door, and now she was on my couch, and that was the only thing that mattered in those first minutes. I worked through the steps, the way I had learned them over years of reading accident reports and medical records, of sitting across from doctors in deposition rooms and asking them to walk me through what cold does to a body and in what order. Core temperature first. Get the trunk warm before the extremities. Warm liquids if she could swallow without difficulty. No direct heat on the skin. The body, when it has been pushed that far, needs to be coaxed back rather than forced. I kept a first aid kit under the bathroom sink that most people would have found excessive. It had been there since the first winter I spent in this cabin, assembled piece by piece over the years, the way a person assembles anything they hope they will never actually need. I worked through it methodically while the 911 dispatcher stayed on the line and the ambulance made its way across town through the snow. Kala watched me from the couch, with an expression I recognized, though I had not seen it on her face before. It was the look of someone recalibrating, trying to fit what they were seeing into the picture they already had. "Dad," she said, and her voice came out rough and uneven like something that had been left out in the cold, along with the rest of her. "How do you know how to do all of this?" I kept my hands moving while I answered her. 30 years, I told her. 30 years working insurance investigations, which sounds like paperwork and phone calls, until you understand what the job actually requires. I spent 3 decades following the space between what people said happened and what the evidence said happened. Workplace injuries that were not quite accidental, household incidents that did not quite add up. I learned early that the most carefully constructed explanations are usually the ones that have been practiced the most, and that the truth tends to live in the details that nobody thought to rehearse. I retired in the spring of 2014. My wife Ruth had been sick for 2 years by then, and when she passed that April, there was not much left in me for the work. We had been married for 25 years. She was 49 years old. I packed up my office on a Friday, and I have not opened a case file since, though the habit of noticing things has never entirely left me. It is not the kind of skill you put down like a set of keys. I live on my pension from the firm and what we managed to save over the years. The cabin is paid off. My needs are simple. I have learned that simplicity is not the same thing as emptiness, though it took me a few years after Ruth to understand that. Kala was quiet for a moment after I finished. The heater ticked steadily. Outside, the snow had settled into the long, patient fall that usually meant it planned to continue until morning. "You knew," she said. It was not quite a question. I looked at her then. "I had suspicions," I said carefully. Since September, I had run into her at a grocery store on the east side of town, a place she had no particular reason to shop, since it was nowhere near the neighborhood where she and Beckett lived. She had been thin in a way that was new, and there had been something in the way she held herself, a careful stillness, a habit of glancing toward the entrance, that I recognized from years of sitting across tables from people who had learned to be afraid of sudden movements. We had talked for 11 minutes. I had counted later because that was the kind of thing I did. She had smiled at all the right moments and deflected every question about how she was doing with the particular fluency of someone who had been deflecting for a long time. I drove home that afternoon, and I sat in this cabin for a long time before I did anything else. The reason I did not go directly to the authorities is something I have thought about every day since September, turning it over, the way you turn over a decision that costs you something to make. The answer is not comfortable, but it is the honest one. Beckett Crane was well regarded in this town. He sat on 2 non-profit boards. He had a lawyer on retainer, who had, from what I could find, successfully dismantled 2 prior complaints against clients in situations that bore certain similarities to this one. A father's concern presented without documentation would have been noted and filed and forgotten before the week was out. I needed something that could not be argued away, so I started building it, quietly, carefully, the way I had built cases for 30 years. I collected what I could from the outside, through means that were available to me, and I waited for the moment when it would be enough. I had not planned for that moment to arrive at 4 in the morning with my daughter on my doorstep. The ambulance pulled into the driveway at 4:26, the red and white lights sweeping across the cabin walls in slow rotations. I heard the crunch of tires on frozen gravel and stood up to meet them at the door. Before I left the room, I glanced down the short hallway toward my bedroom. The closet there held a small fireproof safe bolted to the floor behind the winter coats, the kind of safe that is unremarkable enough that most people would not look twice at it. I had not opened it in 3 days. Inside was a USB drive that I had been adding to carefully and methodically for the past 6 months. I had not yet done what needed to be done with it. The timing had not been right. Standing there in my own hallway, listening to my daughter breathe steadily from the couch behind me, and the paramedics moving up the front steps, I understood that the window I had been waiting for was no longer weeks away. It was closer than that, possibly much closer. There is a particular quality to fluorescent light at 4:30 in the morning that has nothing to do with brightness. It flattens everything. It makes the color go out of people's faces and turns the walls the shade of something that has given up trying. I had been inside Street Charles Medical Center more times than I cared to count over the years, for Ruth mostly toward the end, and I had never once found those lights welcoming. But I had never been more grateful to be standing under them than I was that morning walking beside my daughter's gurney as the paramedics wheeled her through the automatic doors. I kept her hand in mine until they asked me to step back so they could transfer her to a bed. Then I found a spot against the wall, and I stayed there out of the way, but close enough to watch, while the emergency room moved around us with the particular efficiency of people who have learned not to waste motion at this hour. The physician who took her case introduced himself as Dr. Calloway, a man in his late 40s, with the kind of steady, unhurried manner that I associated with people who had seen enough emergencies to stop being surprised by them. He worked through the assessment methodically, checking her temperature, her circulation, her responses. He asked her questions in a calm, measured voice, and she answered them in a voice that was still uneven from the cold and from everything else. I watched Dr. Calloway's hands, and I watched his face because in 30 years of reading people, I had learned that the face often says what the mouth is not saying. He moved through the examination with professional composure until he reached her arms. He pushed the sleeve of the hospital gown up, gently looked at what was there, and then looked again. His hands did not stop moving, but his eyes stayed on that section of her arm for 2 or 3 seconds longer than a medical assessment required. He did not say anything. He did not have to. He ordered a warming blanket and an IV line and a series of further checks, and then he stepped out into the hallway and made a phone call, and I understood what kind of phone call it was. The officer arrived 20 minutes later. He was a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, with a notepad and a pen, and the careful, attentive expression of someone who took his work seriously. He introduced himself as Officer Daltrey with the Bend Police Department, and he pulled a chair up beside Calla's bed, and he asked her gently and without any particular urgency if she would be willing to tell him what had happened that night. Calla looked at the ceiling for a moment before she answered. Then she started talking. I have interviewed hundreds of people over the course of my career. I know what it sounds like when someone is telling a story they have been carrying for a long time. There is a particular quality to it, a kind of flatness in the delivery, as though the emotion has been visited so many times in private that it has worn smooth. Calla spoke that way. The words came out in the careful, sequential order of someone who had rehearsed this account in their own mind many times, without ever intending to say it out loud. She and Beckett had been married for 2 years. The first year had been what she described with a careful neutrality that told me more than the words themselves as fine. The changes had come gradually, beginning around the 18-month mark, introduced so incrementally that she had not been able to identify a moment when things shifted. That was the part she kept returning to, the inability to point to a single day and say before this and after this. The bank accounts had been the first thing. A consolidation, he had called it, a simplification. Her name remained on the paperwork, but the access had narrowed, then narrowed again, until she was requesting money for groceries from a household account she could see but not independently withdraw from. The job had followed. She had been working part-time at a preschool on the north side of Bend, a position she had held for 3 years, and from the way she spoke about it, genuinely loved. Beckett had raised concerns about her hours, about the stress it was creating, about whether it was really necessary given his income. The conversation had happened more than once, in the patient, reasonable tone he used, when he had already decided how something would end. She had stopped working the previous January. After that, the social connections had contracted the way things contract when they are no longer being maintained. Friends stopped hearing from her as often. Plans were canceled. Explanations were offered and accepted, and gradually the calls became less frequent until they stopped altogether. She described this process without apparent bitterness, in the tone of someone describing weather. It had happened. That was the fact of it. Officer Daltrey wrote steadily through all of this. I stood against the wall with my arms crossed, and I listened. And I did not allow my face to change because Calla needed the room to be steady, and I was going to make it steady for her. Then she reached up and pushed her sleeve back. The marks were on the inside of her upper arm, and they were the shape and spacing of a hand. Not fresh, not from last night. The kind that had faded to the particular yellow-green of an injury that was perhaps 10 days old, which meant there had been a moment 10 days ago that had been bad enough to leave that record behind, and which also meant, by simple arithmetic, that there had very likely been moments before that one. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet, when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Officer Daltrey's pen did not stop moving. If anything, it pressed harder against the page, the way a person presses when they are trying to keep their hands doing something useful, because the alternative is to sit with what they are feeling, and there is no time for that right now. I looked at my daughter's face. She was looking at the wall across from her bed, not at me. Not at the officer, just at the neutral surface of a hospital wall. And I understood that she had just done something that had cost her a great deal, and that the cost was not finished yet. From somewhere down the long corridor outside the room, I heard footsteps. Deliberate, evenly spaced, the particular rhythm of someone who walked that way on purpose. I had spent enough years listening to the way people moved to know the difference between someone walking to get somewhere and someone walking to make a point. I knew that walk. I had heard it once before at a charity function 2 winters ago, crossing a hardwood floor in a room full of people who turned to look. I did not need to see the face at the end of the hallway to know who it belonged to. He filled a doorway the way certain men fill a doorway, with the kind of deliberate physical presence that announces itself before the person has said a single word. I had met Beckett Crane exactly 4 times before that morning. A dinner at a restaurant downtown when Calla first introduced us 2 years prior. A holiday gathering the following December that lasted 90 minutes and ended with a handshake I had driven home thinking about for reasons I could not yet name. A chance encounter at a hardware store last spring, where he had been friendly in a way that required a lot of effort to look effortless. And once at a city planning event, where I had watched him work a room with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood that reputation was a resource to be managed. I knew what I was looking at by the time he stepped through the door of Calla's room at 9:30 that morning. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that had no business being that pressed at this hour, which told me he had gone home and changed before coming here. His hair was neat. His expression carried exactly the right proportion of worry to composure the face of a concerned husband who was holding himself together for everyone else's sake. It was a good performance. I had seen better, but not many. He went to Calla first. He said her name and reached for her hand. And I watched her body do something I recognized from the medical records I had spent 30 years reading, that involuntary tightening of preparation, the way a person braces without meaning to. She let him take her hand, but she did not turn toward him. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, on nothing in particular. And she said she was fine in the tone people use when fine is a lid they are holding down over something else entirely. Then he turned to me. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and he lowered his voice, which was the first tactical decision I noted. A man who lowers his voice in a hospital room is a man who understands that the people within earshot are potential witnesses, and that what they hear can be shaped. "Chick, I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I understand why you're here. And I want you to know that whatever Calla has told you, there are 2 sides to every situation." I did not say anything. He took that as an invitation to continue, which was what I intended. 30 years of interviews taught me that silence is not empty. Silence is a space that people feel compelled to fill, and what they choose to fill it with tells you more than any question you could ask. Beckett filled it by raising his voice just slightly, just enough. Not loud enough to be called a scene, but loud enough for the nurse at the station outside the door to hear individual words, if she was paying attention. He talked about misunderstandings. He talked about stress and difficult periods in a marriage. He talked about a father-in-law who had never fully accepted him and who had perhaps encouraged his daughter to see problems where none existed. He said the words in the measured cadence of a reasonable man, making reasonable points, and every 30 seconds or so his volume would drift upward just enough to carry. I stood with my back against the wall and I watched him, and I did not move my face. He was good at this. I wanted to be honest with myself about that. He had clearly done it before in smaller rooms and larger ones, in conversations where the audience was one person and conversations where it was a board of directors. There was a fluency to it that only came from practice. The problem for Beckett was that I had spent the better part of 3 decades sitting across from people who were fluent in exactly this language. I had watched insurance claimants reconstruct entire false histories with total conviction. I had listened to people describe events that had not happened with more apparent sincerity than most people brought to describing events that had. I was not easy to perform for. I had seen too many performances. He shifted tactics after about 4 minutes, which was when he understood that I was not going to interrupt, was not going to defend myself, was not going to give him anything to work with. The reasonable tone dropped a register. Something harder came through underneath it, the way the frame of a building shows through when the finishing materials start to give. "I will destroy everything you have left, old man." He said it quietly, which made it worse. A whisper has a specific kind of weight that a shout does not. Your name, your reputation, whatever it is you think you're doing here. I have resources you cannot match, and I will use every one of them. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I turned the screen toward him so he could see what was displayed. The recording application. The timer running already past the 9-minute mark. I pressed stop. The change in his face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a very small, very contained adjustment, like a single crack appearing in a surface that had presented itself as solid. His eyes moved from the phone to my face and stayed there recalculating. I did not say anything, because there was nothing I needed to say. The sound of sensible heels on linoleum came from the hallway, even and purposeful, and a woman stepped into the doorway behind Beckett. She was perhaps in her early 50s, with reading glasses on a lanyard and a clipboard held across her body, like something she had carried long enough that it had become part of how she stood. She looked at Beckett, then at me, then at Calla, with the particular economy of someone who had learned to read a room in the first 10 seconds, or leave herself at a disadvantage. "Mr. Hale," she said, addressing me directly. "I'm Agnes Whitfield with the Adult Protective Services Division of the Oregon Department of Human Services." She held up an identification badge briefly, then let it fall back against her jacket. "I'd like to speak with you separately if you have a moment." She looked at me with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had not yet decided what she was dealing with. There was no warmth in it, but there was no hostility either. It was the look of a person who operated in the space between those two things until the evidence told her which direction to move. I had no way of knowing, standing there, whether Agnes Whitfield was about to become an obstacle or something else entirely. Agnes set down her clipboard. The sound it made against the side table was softer than I expected, almost gentle, which was not at all how the rest of her felt. She was a broad-shouldered woman with reading glasses pushed to her forehead and a voice that had long since stripped itself of anything unnecessary. She reminded me of the senior field adjusters I had worked beside in my first decade as an investigator. People who had stopped softening their language years ago because softness cost time, and time in their profession was always running short. She laid out her requirements without preamble. Documentation of Calla's immediate living situation. Medical records from Dr. Calloway. A formal statement filed by Officer Daltrey within 72 hours. A follow-up safety assessment conducted by Agnes herself, scheduled within 24 hours of this conversation. I did not interrupt her. I had learned long ago that interrupting people who held authority over something you needed rarely ended well for anyone. When she finished, she looked at me with something that sat between professional caution and reluctant curiosity. 24 hours, Mr. Hale, she said. I understand, I said. She picked up the clipboard and walked out of the consultation room. I sat for a moment in the silence she left behind, letting it settle. Then I squared my shoulders and went to find my daughter. Kala was awake. The IV line ran into the back of her right hand, and the warming blanket was still tucked around her legs, but the color had come back into her face, and her eyes tracked steadily when I stepped through the door. Doctor. Calloway had confirmed that the frostbite on her fingers was superficial. No lasting damage, he said, largely because she had kept moving through the forest and never allowed her core temperature to collapse entirely. Her feet were a different matter. She would not be walking without pain for at least a week. I stood at the edge of the bed and did not speak for a moment. She looked at me the way she had when she was 7 years old and had tumbled from the oak tree in our backyard, not asking for sympathy, just making certain I was still present. I need to take care of some things, I told her. I will be back before evening. She reached out and placed her bandaged hand over mine. Her grip was steadier than I anticipated. That, she said quietly. You do not have to. I know, I said. I want to. She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded and let go. I walked out of St. Charles Medical Center into a mid-morning sky the color of old pewter. The temperature had climbed to 26 degrees, which felt almost bearable after the night before. My truck sat at the far end of the lot, where I had left it, the 1967 Ford dark green rebuilt across 3 winters in my garage, fitted with a transfer case and winter tires that had never failed me in the snow. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. I looked at my left wrist. The Rolex was a date-just stainless steel with a champagne dial. Ruth had given it to me on our 25th anniversary. We had driven up to Crater Lake for the weekend, just the 2 of us, and she had slid it across the breakfast table at the lodge with a small card that read, in her handwriting, "For the man who always knows what time it is, even when he should slow down." I had worn it every single day for the 11 years since. It no longer kept perfect time. I had never sent it for servicing because I did not want anyone else's hands on it. I unclasped the bracelet. I set the watch in my breast pocket face down and started the engine. Cascade timepieces and estate jewelry occupied a narrow storefront on Wall Street in downtown Bend. The display window held a modest arrangement of estate rings and pocket watches. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his late 50s, with the deliberate, unhurried hands of someone who had spent a career handling things that could not be replaced. He examined the Rolex under a loupe without speaking, checking the case back, testing the crown, studying the movement through the crystal for what felt like a long time. 4,200, he said at last. Done, I said. He counted out the bills in 2 stacks, while I signed the transfer form. I did not look at the watch again once I set it on the glass counter. I folded the cash, put it in the envelope I had brought, and walked back out into the cold. I made the second call from the sidewalk outside the shop. Gordon ran a small restoration operation out of a barn near Tamalo, and he had admired my Ford since the first time he saw it parked in front of my cabin 3 years ago. We had spoken about it twice in passing friendly conversations that had never gone anywhere, because I had not been willing to let the truck go. The truck, I said when he answered. I need to sell it today. There was a pause. Today. He arrived 35 minutes later with a cashier's check for $9,800 and a flatbed trailer. We shook hands in the parking lot on Greenwood Avenue. I handed him the keys and the signed title. I watched him begin loading the truck onto the trailer and told myself not to keep watching. I turned and walked to the corner and called a car. Percival Holt's office occupied the 3rd floor of a sandstone building directly across from the Deschutes County Courthouse. I had spent the previous night researching him at my kitchen table while Calla slept in the hospital reading case summaries and public court records until the lamp made my eyes ache. 30 years in practice, a record that other attorneys in Central Oregon discussed the way people discuss significant weather events with a mixture of respect and something that edged toward unease. His assistant showed me in at 2:35 in the afternoon. The office smelled of old paper and wool carpet, warm and still. Through the window behind the desk, the courthouse clock tower rose against a pale winter sky, its stone face the same gray as the clouds. Percival himself was a trim man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the settled and unhurried bearing of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people brought through his door. I did not sit down immediately. I set the envelope on the mahogany desk first, $11,000 in cash, banded in sets of 500, everything the Rolex and the truck had returned to me, minus what I had set aside for the week ahead. Then I reached into my coat pocket and placed the USB drive beside the envelope. It was a small black rectangle no larger than my thumb, and it held 6 months of documentation that I had assembled quietly and methodically since the first week of September, the same way I had once built case files for insurers who needed the truth, laid out in language that would hold up in front of anyone who cared to look. Percival looked at the money. Then he looked at the drive. Then he looked at me. "Where did you get all this?" he asked. I did not answer. I left the USB on the table and said nothing more. Percival opened the laptop. The screen cast a pale blue light across the desk between us. He positioned the computer so we could both see it, then inserted the USB drive into the port with the careful motion of a man who understood that what he was about to examine would require his full attention. A single folder appeared on the desktop labeled in plain text, Calla Evidence May to November 2024. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Start from the beginning," he said. I leaned back and began. It started in September, the third week of the month, a Tuesday afternoon at the Safeway on 3rd Street. I had gone in for coffee and rice, nothing more, and I was standing in the cereal aisle when I saw her. Calla was thinner than she had been at Christmas the year before. Not the kind of thin that comes from a busy stretch of weeks, but the kind that settles into a person when they have stopped eating with any real intention. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, even inside the store. She moved slowly, studying the shelves with the careful concentration of someone afraid of returning home with the wrong item. I called her name. She turned. The smile arrived a half-second late and was assembled rather than natural, the kind of expression I had learned to recognize over 30 years in the field, on the faces of people who had rehearsed how they were supposed to look in public. We spoke for 4 or 5 minutes. She told me she was fine. She answered every question in complete, even sentences as though she had practiced them. When I mentioned coming by the house, she said she would have to check with Beckett first. I drove home and sat in the dark for a long time. I had already known by that point for approximately 6 weeks. The previous month, Beckett had asked me to help configure the smart home system he had installed at the house on Ridgecrest Drive. The locks, the thermostat, the security cameras. He framed it as a favor, the kind of thing a son-in-law does to appear inclusive. I accepted without hesitation, because walking into that house with a legitimate reason to handle his equipment was exactly the kind of opportunity I had spent 3 decades learning to use. He handed me his phone to verify a confirmation code for the lock application. He stepped outside to take a call. I had 4 minutes alone with the device. 4 minutes is a long time when you know what you are doing. I copied the login credentials for the lock application to my own device. I did not change any settings. I did not trigger any alerts. I simply gained the ability to read the access logs every lock command issued, every code change, every entry time-stamped to the second and tied to a specific device. Beckett had no reason to check who was reading the logs, because it had never occurred to him that anyone could. I told Percival this without embellishment. He listened without writing anything down. What the logs showed over the following months was a pattern. The lock code on the front door had been changed remotely on 17 separate occasions between June and November. Several occurred in the early afternoon. 3 occurred after 10 in the evening, on nights when the temperature in Bend dropped below 30 degrees. In each instance, the code was changed from Beckett's phone, and Calla's access profile was suspended before being quietly restored the following morning. He had been locking her out and letting her back in, and she had said nothing to anyone. Alongside the lock logs, the USB held other material. Photographs I had taken on 2 occasions, images showing a bruise along Calla's left forearm, visible for just a moment when she reached past the curtain to close it. Financial transfer records showing $16,000 moved in small increments from a joint account into a separate account registered solely in Beckett's name. Screenshots of text messages captured during those 4 minutes with his phone messages that Percival now read slowly, his jaw set and still. And the emails, sent from a secondary address, addressed to Calla's personal account, telling her in precise and clinical language what would happen if she contacted her father, if she spoke to anyone from her former school, if she attempted to move money, or do anything without his knowledge. Percival scrolled through the final page and did not speak for a moment. "How long did you wait before bringing this forward?" he asked. "Until he could not explain it away," I said. "One weak piece of evidence, and a man like Beckett walks out of the room and spends the next 6 months ensuring no one believes another word my daughter says. I needed it complete." Percival nodded. He closed the folder and looked at me. "This is enough to put him away for years," he said. The words were level measured, but they carried a particular weight, the weight of someone who had seen many case files and understood, without saying so, that this one was different in its degree of deliberateness. The financial transfers alone support a felony charge. Combined with the lock logs and the documented isolation, this is a pattern, not an incident. I said nothing. I had not come here to feel relieved, and I was not ready for that yet. "I will need to establish chain of custody before we file anything," Percival said. "Can you account for every step of how this material was obtained?" "Every step," I said. He reached for his legal pad and began writing. My phone vibrated on the arm of the chair. I picked it up from habit, a reflex left over from 30 years of carrying a device that was always one call away from something requiring immediate attention. The message was from a number I did not recognize. No name, no area code I could place. "I know what Beckett did to your daughter. I have seen it before. Please call me." I stared at it without moving. Then I set the phone face down on the arm of the chair and looked back at Percival, who was still writing, unaware of what had just arrived. Outside the window, the courthouse clock tower stood against the gray November sky, patient and indifferent. The way Old Stone always is when the people inside are deciding something that cannot be undecided. The call took 40 seconds. I was standing on the sidewalk outside Percival's building when I dialed the number back, the cold working its way through my coat collar. The courthouse across the street, still and gray in the afternoon light. The line rang twice. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice careful and measured in the way that people speak when they have rehearsed what they are going to say but are still afraid of saying it. She told me her name was Nadine Forsyth. She told me she had seen the name Beckett Crane on a local news update that morning. A brief item about an ongoing Adult Protective Services investigation, nothing detailed. Just enough to surface a name she had spent 4 years trying to stop thinking about. She told me she lived in Bend and that she was at St. Charles right now in the main corridor near the east entrance, and that she would understand completely if I did not want to come. I told her to stay where she was. I recognized her before she recognized me. She was standing near the far end of the corridor beside a row of chairs along the window wall, wearing a gray wool coat and holding a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. 38 years old, according to what she had told me on the phone, though she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone considerably older, the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is instead the result of having learned, over a long period of time, to take up as little space as possible. When I introduced myself, She looked at me with eyes that I recognized immediately, though I had never seen her before in my life. They were the same eyes I had seen on Calla in the ambulance 3 days ago and in the Safeway 2 months before that. And in the photographs I had taken through the kitchen curtain, the eyes of someone who had lived inside a situation that no one on the outside could quite believe and had stopped expecting to be believed. We sat down together in the chairs by the window. She told me the year was 2021 when it began. She had met Beckett at a development launch event in downtown Bend. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who made a room feel smaller, in a way that seemed at first like a gift. They were together for 14 months. She had moved into his previous property on the west side of the city, a house with a smart lock system and a security arrangement that he managed entirely from his phone. The pattern she described was identical to what I had documented over the past 6 months. The lock codes changed without warning. Her phone contacts reduced one by one as arguments followed any attempt to reach people he did not approve of. Her bank access restricted, then redirected. Her car keys placed somewhere other than where she had left them, then returned without comment when she stopped asking. She had reported it to the Bend Police Department in the autumn of 2021. She had gone in person, filed a formal statement, provided what documentation she had at the time. Beckett's attorney had appeared within 48 hours. The case file had been reviewed, assessed as lacking sufficient physical evidence to support the charges as filed and closed. He knew exactly how much to do and how to do it, Nadine said. Nothing he did left a mark that held up on paper. That was the point. Her hands were resting in her lap around the paper cup, and I could see that they were not entirely steady, a fine, persistent tremor that she was clearly aware of and had chosen not to conceal. But her voice did not waver. She spoke with the flat, factual precision of someone who had told this story to themselves so many times that the emotion had been worn smooth, leaving only the structure. "The case file," I said. "You still have a copy." "I kept everything," she said. The original report number, the detective's name, the date it was closed. I kept it because I thought someday it might matter to someone. She reached into her bag and produced a folded envelope which she held for a moment before placing it on the chair between us. "When I thought I was the only one," she said. "I am sorry I did not speak sooner." I did not tell her there was nothing to apologize for, because I did not think that was what she needed to hear. What I told her was that the document in that envelope had the potential to change the legal position of an ongoing case significantly, and that an attorney named Percival Holt, whose office was directly across from the Deschutes County Courthouse, would almost certainly want to speak with her in the coming days if she was willing. She looked at me for a moment. "Will it help Calla?" "Yes," I said. "It will." She nodded, once the way people nod when they have been waiting a long time for a sentence that simple. I understood, walking back to the east entrance of St. Charles with the envelope in my coat pocket, what Nadine's file represented in legal terms. A single incident, even one as thoroughly documented as the material on the USB drive, could be argued in front of a judge as a dispute between two people, complicated, contested, subject to interpretation. Two incidents separated by 4 years with two different women following an identical pattern of behavior shifted the argument entirely. It was no longer a question of whether Calla was telling the truth. It became a question of whether a court was willing to look at a documented pattern of deliberate conduct and call it what it was. Percival had explained this to me once in passing, during a different conversation, about a different kind of case years ago before I retired. I had filed it away the way I filed everything, not because I expected to need it, but because information stored carefully has a way of becoming useful at precisely the moment you least expect. I stepped outside into the cold and called him before I reached the parking lot. He answered on the second ring. "There is a woman named Nadine Forsyth," I said. "She was with Beckett Crane in 2021. Same pattern. She filed a police report in Bend that autumn. The case was closed for insufficient evidence, but the file still exists." There was a pause on the line, that lasted exactly as long as it takes an experienced attorney to understand the full weight of what he has just been told. "Can she testify?" Percival asked. "She kept every document," I said. "And she is willing." Another pause, shorter this time. "Young Warren," he said. "We do not just have a crime. We have a pattern. That changes everything." I stood on the sidewalk outside St. Charles and looked up at the sky, which had gone the deep, solid gray of late afternoon in November, the kind of gray that sits on the Cascades like a held breath. Somewhere above the cloud line, the sun was still moving west toward the mountains. I could not see it from where I stood, but I knew it was there. Kala had been home for one full day. She slept in the room that had been hers when she was 12 years old, under the same wool blanket I had kept folded on the shelf above the closet for no reason I could ever adequately explain. I had made up the bed with clean sheets the afternoon she was discharged, and I had not said anything about it, and neither had she. Some things did not require explanation between us. That had always been true, even during the years when Beckett had done his best to make it otherwise. By the second evening, she was moving more easily around the cabin. Her feet still hurt. She walked with a careful, deliberate step that she was clearly trying to conceal, but the color had fully returned to her face. And she had eaten a proper dinner for the first time since I had found her on the porch 3 mornings ago. We sat by the wood stove after the meal and did not say very much, and that was all right. There was still a great deal ahead of us, and we both knew it. And sometimes the most useful thing 2 people can do is simply occupy the same warm room in silence. I went to bed at 10:30. I was not asleep when the knocking started at 11. It was not knocking precisely. It was the flat, open palm impact of someone who had stopped caring about the impression he was making hard, irregular. The sound of a man whose composure had come apart somewhere between wherever he had been drinking and the end of my front walkway. I was already sitting up in bed before the third impact landed. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the button before I stood. The small red indicator confirmed it was running. Then I pulled on my boots without lacing them, crossed the bedroom in the dark, and moved to the top of the stairs. I already knew who it was. I had known the moment the first blow landed against the door, the same way you recognize a voice before you see the face, not because of any particular quality of the sound, but because there are only so many people in the world whose anger arrives at your door in the middle of the night. And I had only one outstanding problem of that magnitude. "Open the door." His voice was loud enough to be heard clearly from the second floor, the words slightly imprecise at the edges in the way that indicates a man who has had enough to drink to stop monitoring himself. "She is my wife. You cannot keep her from me. Open the door right now." I did not open the door. I dialed 911 from the bottom of the stairs, stated my address on Ridgeline Road, told the dispatcher that an intoxicated individual was attempting to force entry into my residence and that I had a family member inside. I kept my voice level. I kept the recording application running on the same device. "Sir, stay on the line," the dispatcher said. The front window of the living room came in. Not all at once, first the sound of something striking the glass, then a second impact, then the particular cascading crash of a pane giving way under sustained force. Cold air moved through the room, immediately sharp and immediate, carrying the smell of pine and night. I stepped back toward the base of the stairs as Beckett came through the window frame, one hand on the sill, his dress shirt torn at the shoulder where the remaining glass had caught it. He was not the man I had watched perform in the hospital corridor 3 days ago. That man had been composed, deliberate, managing every word and gesture with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. This man was something else entirely. His eyes were unfocused and too wide, and there was a particular quality of desperation in his movements that I recognized from 30 years of watching people who had just learned that the story they had been telling about themselves was no longer going to hold. His attorney had told him about Nadine. That much was clear. He crossed the living room in 4 strides and shoved me with both hands before I could move clear of his path. I caught the edge of the stair rail with my left hand, but missed my footing on the first step, and the fall was short and immediate, and very bad, my right side connecting with the corner of the bottom stair in a way that sent a white, clean pain through my ribs that I recognized, even in the moment as structural rather than muscular. I lay on the floor at the base of the stairs and focused on breathing. Kala appeared at the top of the staircase. She was standing in the doorway of her room in the gray sweatshirt she had worn to bed, her bandaged hands at her sides, looking down at the scene below her at Beckett, standing in the middle of the living room with broken glass behind him and cold air moving through the cabin, and at me on the floor at the base of the stairs, one hand pressed against my right side. I watched her face. I had spent 2 months watching Kala's face from a distance across a supermarket aisle through a kitchen curtain, in the dim light of a hospital room, and I had learned to read the particular quality of restraint that had replaced what used to be there. The habit of making herself smaller, the careful blankness that had settled over her features like a second skin. It was not there now. She looked at Beckett with the clear, direct focus of someone who has finally stopped trying to see something other than what is actually in front of them. She did not look away. She did not lower her eyes. "Did I see you now?" she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "I finally see you." Beckett turned toward the sound of her voice. Whatever he had come here intending to say appeared to leave him entirely. He stood there in the wreckage of the front window with the cold pouring in around him, and he looked for the first time since I had known him like a man who had run out of performance. Officer Daltrey came through the front door 40 seconds later. The paramedics confirmed 2 cracked ribs on the right side and recommended imaging to rule out additional injury. They helped me onto the gurney and moved me toward the ambulance, and every breath I took between the cabin floor and the open rear doors of the vehicle was a distinct and specific event, sharp enough to require conscious management. I turned my head when they loaded me in. Kala was standing outside the ambulance doors in the cold, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me with an expression I had not seen on her face in longer than I could accurately calculate. She was standing with her full height, her shoulders level, her chin up, not performing composure, simply occupying it, the way she used to when she was young and had not yet learned to make herself smaller for anyone. Every breath was a blade through my right side. I smiled at her anyway. The ceiling of room 114 at St. Charles Medical Center was acoustic tile off-white, with a small water stain in the upper left corner shaped like nothing in particular. I had been studying it for approximately 40 minutes, by the time the winter light outside the window had brightened enough to qualify as morning. Breathing was a managed process. The imaging the previous night had confirmed 2 cracked ribs on the right side, no pneumothorax, no displaced fractures. The attending physician had used the word fortunate in a tone that suggested he had seen the alternative often enough to mean it. They had taped the ribs, administered something for the pain that had worn off somewhere around 4 in the morning, and left me with instructions to remain still and a call button I had not used. I was not good at remaining still. Kala was in the chair beside the window. She had been there when I woke. Already dressed, her bandaged hands folded in her lap, watching the parking lot below with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to wait out long stretches of time without filling them. We had spoken briefly. She was all right. She had slept. She did not want me to apologize for what had happened the night before. I told her I was not going to apologize. She almost smiled. The door opened at 8:47. Agnes Whitfield came in without knocking, which I noted but did not remark on. She was wearing a dark coat over a gray sweater. Her reading glasses pushed up to her forehead in the same position they had occupied during every previous encounter. But she was not carrying the clipboard. That absence registered before anything else. The clipboard had been up to this point as much a part of her presence as her voice or her posture. And without it, she looked like a different version of the same person, one who had decided for reasons of her own to arrive today without the official apparatus. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room to the side of the bed without asking permission and sat down. Kala looked up from the window. "I will not take long," Agnes said. She looked at me, then at Calla, then back at me. "I wanted to come in person." She had been with Adult Protective Services for 22 years. She told me this not as a credential, but as context, in the flat, matter-of-fact way that people state things they have long since stopped finding remarkable about themselves. 22 years of case files, home visits, documentation, court appearances, and phone calls to attorneys in the early hours of the morning. She had seen, she said, a sufficient number of controlled living situations to recognize the architecture of one within the first 10 minutes of entering a residence. She had entered the residence on Ridgecrest Drive on the morning of day 2, following Officer Daltrey's formal report to the Adult Protective Services intake office. The visit had been conducted under standard APS protocol, announced at the door, accompanied by a Bend PD officer. Duration, approximately 90 minutes. What she had found, she described to me in the same, even unembellished register she used for everything else. The medicine cabinet in the primary bathroom contained a controlled anxiolytic prescription issued in Calla's name. The prescription bottle had a combination lock affixed to its cap, an aftermarket device available online, with the combination known only to the account holder who had ordered it. The account, she noted, was registered to Beckett Crane. The joint checking account linked to the address had been placed in a restricted access state 31 days prior, requiring dual authorization for any withdrawal above $40. Calla's authorization credentials had been removed from the account profile 17 days ago. The window in the secondary bedroom, the room that Calla had been using as a workspace before she left her teaching position, had been fitted with an external slide bolt mounted on the outside of the frame. Agnes finished her account and looked at me without expression. "I know what a cage looks like, Mr. Hale," she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Calla had turned fully from the window and was sitting with her hands in her lap, listening without moving. Agnes reached into the leather folder she had been carrying under her arm and placed a document on the surface of the bedside table, a formal APS assessment report, 8 pages, dated that morning. She did not hand it to me. She set it down flat, the way you set something down when you want the other person to reach for it on their own terms. I looked at it without picking it up. I could read the summary line on the cover page from where I lay. Findings substantiated. Risk level high. Recommendation: immediate protective intervention and coordination with law enforcement. Every box that could be checked had been checked, and every box that had been checked was in Calla's favor. Agnes straightened her coat and looked at Calla for a moment, a long, direct look that carried something in it I had not seen from her before. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The particular acknowledgement that passes between two people when one of them understands from professional experience exactly what the other one has been living through. "Your daughter is lucky," Agnes said, turning back to me, "that you did not give up on her." She picked up her folder and walked out without waiting for a response. The room held her absence for a moment. I looked at Calla. She was looking at the door Agnes had just closed, and there was something moving across her face that she was not trying to control or conceal. Not grief, not relief, but something in between the two that did not have a clean name and did not need one. I reached for the APS report with my left hand, moving carefully to avoid engaging the right side of my ribcage, and set it on the bed beside me. 14 minutes later, the door opened again. Percival Holt was still wearing his coat, which meant he had come directly from somewhere without stopping. He stepped into the room, looked at me, looked briefly at Calla, and looked back at me. He was carrying nothing. No briefcase, no folder, no legal pad. And there was something in his expression that I had not seen during either of our previous meetings in his office. A quality I needed a moment to identify because it was not an effect I associated with him. It was, I realized, the particular brightness that enters a person's eyes when they are in possession of something they did not expect to find and have not yet had time to fully process. "Someone walked into my office this morning with a box," he said. "You need to see what is inside it." I looked at him, In 30 years of working cases, I had learned to read the difference between a development that changes the margin of a situation and a development that changes the situation entirely. The look on Percival's face belonged to the second category. For the first time since he had taken my retainer 2 days ago, there was something unmistakable in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was going to win. If you're still here with me, comment still watching so I know you're right here. And tell me this. If it were you, would you stay calm and wait for the right moment, or face him the second he showed up at your door? Because what happened next changed everything. And just a quick note. Parts of the story ahead may include fictional elements for storytelling purposes. If this isn't for you, feel free to stop here. Percival had arranged 2 chairs side by side in front of his desk, angled toward his laptop screen. I noticed it when I walked in. We were going to watch something together, not discuss it. My ribs registered every step of the 3 flights of stairs, but I had not considered not coming. Silas Drummond was already seated. He was a slight man, 71, with white, close-cropped hair, and the careful posture of someone whose body had begun to require conscious management. His hands rested on top of a cardboard box in his lap, and they carried a faint, persistent tremor he made no effort to conceal. He looked up when I entered with the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a decision alone too long and has finally arrived at the moment of setting it down. Percival introduced us. Silas shook my hand firmly despite the tremor. "I should have come sooner," he said. It was the second time in a week that someone had said those words to me. He had read Percival's name in the Bend Bulletin 3 days earlier, a brief item noting that local attorney Percival Holt had been retained in connection with an ongoing APS investigation. It had not given details. It had not needed to. Silas had known for 3 months that something was wrong next door, and seeing a legal name attached to the matter had been the thing that finally moved him from watching to acting. He had driven downtown without calling ahead, placed the cardboard box on the front counter, and said he believed the contents might be relevant. Percival had seen him within 20 minutes. "I put the camera up in August," Silas said. "My property line runs along the east side of their yard. Clear view of the front entrance from my porch railing." He paused. "I had a feeling. I have had feelings before and not acted on them. I know what that costs." Percival leaned forward. "The camera mounted on your property directed outward. On my porch railing. The front entrance is visible from the street. Anyone walking past could see it. Oregon law permits recording from your own property directed at areas visible from public space," Percival said. He looked briefly at me. "The footage is legally obtained. We can use it." Silas lifted the lid from the box. Inside were 4 external hard drives labeled with date ranges in black marker and a folded sheet noting specific timestamps. He had been thorough in the way people are thorough when they understand that details matter. Percival connected the first drive and found the timestamp without difficulty. The footage was high-definition shot from an elevated angle taking in the full front entrance of the Ridgecrest Drive property, the porch light above the door, and a portion of the interior living room visible through the large front window. The timestamp read, the 14th of November, 8:43 in the evening. The living room was lit and populated the launch party guests circulating with drinks. Near the window, a man in a dark shirt stood holding a phone, his attention on the screen rather than the room. Beckett Crane. Operating his phone with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this particular thing many times before. 40 seconds in, a figure appeared at the front door. Kala. The thin coat. The one that was not enough for 19 degrees. She knocked once, twice, then a third time with more force. She tried the handle. She pressed her face toward the narrow window beside the frame. Inside the living room, Beckett glanced toward the door. He looked back at his phone. He tapped the screen twice. The porch light went out. Kala stood in complete darkness on the front step. Then she turned and walked toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Percival paused the footage. None of us spoke for a moment. "This is not negligence," Percival said quietly. "This is deliberate." Silas looked at his hands. "She reminds me of my daughter," he said. His voice was steady only because considerable effort was being applied to keeping it so. My daughter was in a marriage I knew was wrong. I told myself it was not my place, that she was an adult, that she would find her own way out. He stopped. She did not find her own way out. Not the way I hoped. He did not say what had happened. The shape of it was clear enough. I lost her. Different reason. But I lost her. The room held the silence for a moment. "You are here now, Silas," I said. "That is what matters." He nodded once the way a man nods when he does not trust himself to say anything further. Percival closed the footage window. "I will catalog and authenticate each drive before entering them into the record," he said. 48 hours minimum. The timestamps will be cross-referenced against the lock application logs from the USB. When that is complete, we will have the logs showing the code was changed remotely and footage showing the exact moment it was done and who was holding the phone. He paused. No reasonable argument against that combination exists. He reached out and closed the laptop. "No, there is something you should know before you leave," he said. Beckett was released on bail approximately 1 hour ago. His attorney posted $20,000 within 30 minutes of the hearing. No prior criminal record established business standing. The magistrate set the amount at the low end of the schedule. He looked at me. "He is out." I looked at the box of hard drives on the desk. Beckett was free. He knew about Nadine. He knew I had retained counsel. He was somewhere in Bend right now with his phone in his hand and nothing left to lose. The drives on that desk needed to survive the next 48 hours. So did we. The television in room 114 had a remote control mounted on a plastic arm beside the bed, and I had not touched it once since they brought me up from the imaging suite the night before. Calla turned it on at 10:30 without explanation and changed the channel twice before stopping. Beckett was already at the microphone. He had chosen the steps of the Deschutes County Courthouse as his backdrop, a deliberate choice, I noted. The kind of visual that places a man in proximity to institutions of authority without requiring him to be accountable to any of them. He was wearing a charcoal suit and no overcoat, despite the cold, which communicated endurance. His hair was neat. His hands were clasped in front of him, at the precise angle that reads on camera as composure under duress. He had prepared this carefully. The statement he gave lasted 11 minutes. I timed it. In those 11 minutes, he described a marriage that he characterized as loving and stable until the involvement of an outside party. He did not use my name immediately. He let the implication build for several minutes before saying it, which was the correct technique for an audience that had not yet made up its mind. When he did say it, he said it quietly with a brief pause before and after, as though the name itself cost him something to speak. Warren Hale, his wife's father, a man, Beckett said, who had never accepted the marriage, who had inserted himself repeatedly into their private life, who had, in his telling, constructed an elaborate set of allegations from nothing more than the grievances of a father who could not release his daughter into her own adult life. His voice broke in one place. Precisely one place, approximately 8 minutes in, when he spoke about Calla specifically. His eyes reddened at the outer corners. He looked briefly away from the camera, and then back the way people look away when they are working to contain genuine emotion, or when they have practiced the gesture until it reads as genuine. I had interviewed enough people over 30 years to know the difference. He was very good. Calla was sitting in the chair beside the window, the same chair she had occupied since the morning. She was watching the screen with her hands folded in her lap, and she was not trembling. She had been trembling in small, involuntary ways since the night she arrived at my door, a residual response, the body processing what the mind had not yet fully absorbed. It had been diminishing steadily over the past several days. It was entirely absent now. What was there instead was something colder and more deliberate. She watched Beckett speak with the focused, unblinking attention of someone cataloging information rather than receiving it, noting the pauses, the glances. The calibrated break in his voice and her expression did not shift once during the full 11 minutes. When the press conference ended and the local anchor began speaking, Calla reached out and turned the television off. "He's very good at that," she said. "Yes," I said. "He is." She looked at the blank screen for a moment. "It will work on some people." "It will," I said. "Not enough of them." The reaction in Bend over the following hours was, as I had anticipated, divided. The local news comment sections and community forums split along the lines. They always split along in situations like this. Those who found Beckett's grief convincing and those who had seen the APS investigation item in the bulletin and were inclined to hold their conclusions. A former colleague of Calla's from the kindergarten posted a brief public statement saying only that she had noticed changes in Calla over the preceding year and that she believed her. It was shared 40 times before noon. None of it was the point. I knew it was not the point, because Percival had told me it was not the point on the phone 2 evenings ago when I had raised the possibility of Beckett using the media. "Let him talk," he had said. "Every word he says in public is a weapon we can use." A man who gives a press conference before his case goes to trial is a man who has just handed us 11 minutes of documented public statements that we can hold against anything he says on the stand. I had written it down. I had kept the note on the bedside table next to the APS report. I called Percival at 11:47. I did not wait for him to call me. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting it. "I watched it," I said. "As did I," he said. "All 11 minutes. You told me to let him talk." "I did," he said. "And I meant it. What he said this morning is now part of the public record, and it directly contradicts the documented evidence we have in hand. That contradiction will be visible to any judge who looks at both." He paused. "But there is something more immediate." I waited. "He violated 3 conditions of his release this morning," Percival said. "His bail terms prohibit any public statement regarding the case or its parties without prior approval of the court. They prohibit contact or communication, direct or indirect, with any named witness. And they prohibit actions that could reasonably be interpreted as intimidation of a complainant." He paused again briefly. "A press conference naming you by implication and characterizing Calla's account as fabricated touches all 3. I am filing the motion to revoke bail tonight." I looked at the window. The snow had started again. Sometime in the last hour, I could see it in the light from the parking lot below, fine and steady. The kind of snow that accumulates quietly and is deep before you notice it. "There is one more thing," Percival said. His voice shifted slightly, not in volume but in register, the way a person's voice shifts when they are moving from information to warning. His attorney accessed the witness list this afternoon through standard discovery channels. "It is a legal process, I cannot prevent it. But it means Beckett now knows every name on that list." I already knew what he was going to say next. "He knows Nadine's name," Percival said. I did not respond immediately. I sat with it for a moment. The specific weight of that sentence, what it meant for a woman who had spent 4 years keeping herself at a careful distance from a man she had every reason to fear, and who had come forward anyway, because she had decided it mattered more than the risk. "Understood," I said. I will have someone contact her tonight," Percival said. "Do not call her yourself. Let me handle it through proper channels." "All right," I said. I ended the call and set the phone on the bedside table. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall fine, patient, indifferent, settling across the parking lot and the roofline of the building opposite, and the dark shape of the Cascades beyond the city, visible tonight only as an absence of stars along the horizon. I looked at it for a long time. I had been in enough situations over the years to recognize the particular quality of a night that is not going to stay quiet. The pressure of it was familiar. The sense of variables moving in the dark, of decisions being made by people you could not see, of a situation that had been building steadily now approaching the point where it would either hold or break. Tonight was that kind of night. The drive across Bend took 18 minutes. Percival had told me not to go. He had said it clearly, and for good reasons, proper channels, chain of custody, the importance of keeping a clean line between what the legal process required and what I wanted to do as a father. I understood his reasoning. I had agreed with it on the phone 40 minutes earlier. Then I had looked at the snow outside the hospital window and thought about Nadine Forsyth, sitting alone in a house with the lights off, waiting to see whether the decision she had made was going to cost her everything again. And I had gotten my coat and my keys and told Calla I would be back within the hour. Some things you understand with your professional judgment and override with something older. Her house was a single-story craftsman on the east side of Bend, a quiet street lined with mature ponderosa pines that had collected the evening snowfall along their upper branches. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. But her car was in the driveway, and the engine hood was cold when I passed it, which meant she had been home for several hours. I knocked twice, a long pause, then the sound of a chain being drawn back. She opened the door and looked at me without surprise, which told me she had been expecting someone, though perhaps not me specifically. She was wearing a dark cardigan over a collared shirt, her hair pulled back, and her eyes were red at the rims in the way that follows extended crying that has since resolved into something quieter and more deliberate. She was standing with her full height, her shoulders level, her chin neither raised nor lowered. It was the posture of someone who had arrived recently, and at some cost, at a decision. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Come in." She told me about the call while we sat at her kitchen table, both of us with untouched cups of coffee between us. Beckett had reached her at 8:30, not from his own number, but from one she did not recognize, which she had answered, because she had been expecting a call from her mother's care facility. When she heard his voice, she said her first instinct had been to end the call immediately. She had not ended it. He had spoken for less than 2 minutes. He had not threatened her directly. She was clear about this, precise in the way that people are precise when they have been replaying an exchange and have identified exactly what was and was not said. His language had been careful, even gentle. He had expressed concern for her well-being. He had noted that the legal process could be lengthy and publicly difficult for everyone involved. He had said near the end in a tone she described as almost conversational, "You do not want to do this, Nadine. You know how this ends." Then he had ended the call. She had sat with her phone in her hand for a long time after that. She had turned off the lights not because she was afraid of being seen, but because she found it easier to think in the dark. She had been, she told me, very close to calling Percival's office and withdrawing her statement. Then she had turned on the television and seen Calla's name on the local news segment covering the APS investigation. "I kept thinking about 4 years ago," she said. "Standing in the police station filling out the report, knowing it was not going to hold, knowing that when I walked back out the front door, I was going to be alone with whatever came next." She looked at her coffee cup. "That is the thing he relies on. That the person he has chosen will be alone. That there will be no one on the other side of it." She looked up at me. "The difference between her and me," she said, "is that she has you. I had no one." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, visible in the light above the back porch. I thought about everything I might say in response to that sentence, and found that most of it was inadequate. "You have us now," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the table and pulled the document toward her, the formal witness statement that Percival had prepared and sent to her by secure courier that afternoon. 8 pages. Notarized signature line at the bottom of the final page. She picked up the pen. Her hand as she signed was entirely steady. Not the stillness of suppression, not the careful management of a tremor being held in check, simply steady, in the way that a hand is steady when the person holding the pen has finished deciding and is now only doing. She signed each page without pausing, turned back to the first, and set the pen down. "What happens now?" she asked. "Percival files it with the court tomorrow morning," I said. Combined with the footage and the USB evidence, it establishes a documented pattern across two separate relationships spanning 4 years. His attorney will know the moment it enters the record that the case has changed. She nodded slowly. "And Beckett, Sitaku, he made a choice tonight," I said. "He called you. That choice has consequences he does not fully understand yet." The knock at the front door came at 10:43. I recognized Officer Daltrey through the narrow window beside the frame before Nadine reached the handle. He was in uniform, which meant this was an official visit, and he was alone, which meant it was not an arrest. He nodded at me when the door opened, then looked at Nadine with the particular directness of someone delivering information that is both serious and in its own way clarifying. "Ms. Forsyth," he said, "I wanted to tell you in person." He glanced briefly at me, then back at her. "Earlier this evening, an attempt was made to access your 2021 police report through a third-party data service. The access attempt was traced to a device registered to an associate of Beckett Crane's legal team." He paused. "Under Oregon statute that constitutes witness tampering, it is a separate criminal charge independent of the existing case." Nadine was quiet for a moment. "He tried to get my file," she said. "He did," Daltrey said. "And in doing so, he handed us something we did not have yesterday." He looked at me. "He just made our case considerably simpler, Mr. Hale." I said nothing. There was a particular quality to this moment that I recognized from 3 decades of watching cases turn the moment when the person who believed they were the one applying pressure realizes, too late, that they have been pressing against a door that opens the wrong way. Beckett had called Nadine to frighten her into silence. Then he had attempted to access evidence to understand the scope of what she knew. Each action taken in the belief that it would protect him had instead added a charge, created a record, and demonstrated to any court that would later examine it exactly the kind of man he was. He had built his own case for us. I drove back through the snow at 11:30, the roads quiet, the city reduced to amber streetlight on white ground, and the occasional distant shape of a plow working the main arterials. My ribs ached with each gear change, a steady, reliable pain that I had stopped trying to manage and started simply accounting for. I thought about Nadine's hand on the pen, steady without effort. I thought about what Daltrey had said on the porch, somewhere between the east side of the city and the road up toward my cabin. I became aware of something I had not felt in the weeks since I had first noticed the look on Kala's face in the cereal aisle of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon in September. A thing that was not hope exactly, and not relief exactly, but that carried the quality of both, something that felt for the first time in a long time like certainty. We had been in Ben's only downtown hotel that accepted last-minute bookings for 3 days. It had been Percival's suggestion, made quietly and without elaboration at the end of our final pretrial meeting, that Kala and I should not be staying at the cabin during the days immediately preceding the hearing. I had not asked him to explain his reasoning. The cabin's front window had been repaired, but some thresholds once crossed do not return to what they were before. Kala had agreed without discussion, and we had checked in on a Thursday evening with 2 bags between us and spent the following days doing the small, ordinary things that people do when they are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. The morning of the trial, I was awake before 5. I knocked on the door of her room at 7:15, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the machine at the end of the corridor. She called for me to come in. The door was unlocked. She was sitting at the narrow vanity table against the far wall in the chair that the room provided for the purpose, looking at herself in the mirror. Not applying anything, not arranging anything, simply looking. Her hands were flat on the surface of the table on either side of the coffee cup she had already made for herself, and her reflection looked back at her with an expression that I could not fully read from the doorway. I set the second cup beside hers and stood at the edge of the room without speaking. There are moments that do not require commentary, and I had learned over the course of the past 2 months which ones they were. After a while, she said, "I keep trying to remember the last time I looked at myself like this." I did not answer because the sentence was not a question. Percival arrived at 8. He sat in the single armchair in the corner of the room with the trial folder open across his knee and went through the day's sequence one final time, not because any of us had forgotten it, but because that is what preparation looks like at the end of a long process when the work is finished, and what remains is the discipline of not second-guessing it. He explained again the structure of the proceeding. Beckett's attorney had opted for a bench trial, the decision rendered by a judge alone without a jury. It was, Percival noted, a calculation that made a particular kind of sense from the defense perspective. Juries respond to emotion. A jury looking at Calla might respond to her in ways that were difficult to predict and harder to control. A judge, the reasoning went, would apply the law with clinical impartiality and might be less susceptible to the weight of two women's testimony. It was, Percival said, with the flat, settled certainty of someone who had tried cases before both a miscalculation. A jury could be swayed by a well-constructed narrative. A judge who had spent 30 years on the bench in Deschutes County had reviewed enough documentation to understand without prompting the difference between an isolated incident and a deliberate, sustained pattern of coercive control. The evidence we were presenting was not emotional. It was architectural. It had been built over 6 months by a former insurance investigator who had spent his career constructing arguments that held up under professional scrutiny. Emotion was Beckett's territory. Documentation was ours. The bench trial also moved faster. 2 months between the incident and the trial date was achievable precisely because there was no jury selection process, no extended voir dire, no drawn-out procedural delays. The evidence had been authenticated, the witness list confirmed the motions filed and ruled upon. We were ready. Beckett was not, though his attorney had not yet fully understood that. When Percival left to go over final filings at the courthouse, Calla and I sat for a few minutes in the quiet of the hotel room. The window looked out over a side street gray, and still in the January morning, a thin layer of new snow on the parked cars and the windowsills of the building opposite. "Were you scared?" she asked. "When you were collecting all that evidence, all those months?" I considered giving her the answer that would have been most reassuring. Then I considered that she had spent 2 years in a situation where the people around her had been careful always about what they said and what they left out, and I set that impulse aside. "Every single day," I said. Scared that I was moving too slowly. Scared that something would happen before I had enough. Scared that one piece of it would not hold up and the whole case would come apart. She was quiet for a moment. "How did you keep going?" "Fear does not mean stop," I said. "It means be careful." She looked at the window for a moment. Then she stood up from the edge of the bed and crossed to the small closet where she had hung the clothes she had brought. She looked at them for a moment. 2 options, both appropriate, neither of them the kind of choice that required any input from me. She reached in and made her selection without asking. I had not seen her do that, make a simple, autonomous choice about something that belonged entirely to herself in longer than I could accurately track. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She dressed without comment. She checked her reflection, once briefly made no adjustment, and turned from the mirror. "I am ready," she said. The Uber dropped us at the Deschutes County Courthouse at 9:40. The building's stone facade was the same pale gray as the January sky above it, the flag above the entrance moving in a slow, cold wind coming down from the Cascades. Percival was waiting on the steps with his briefcase and the particular settled stillness of a man who has done this enough times to have stopped being nervous about it. Beckett's car was already in the lot across the street, the black Range Rover engine off one of his attorneys visible through the passenger window, reviewing documents with the focused, forward-leaning posture of someone who has not yet received the information that would change his orientation. We went inside. The corridor of the courthouse smelled of old stone and floor wax, warm after the outside cold, the particular institutional warmth of buildings that have been heated against winter for many decades. We checked in at the clerk's window, confirmed the courtroom assignment, and walked the length of the corridor to the double doors at the far end. I pushed the door open. Beckett was already seated at the defense table on the far side of the room. He was wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt. Not the suit, not the charcoal presentation of the man on the courthouse steps in November. Not the pressed confidence of the hospital corridor. The jacket was what it was. The clothes of a defendant sitting in the position that the proceeding had assigned him, in a room that no longer belonged to him in any of the ways that rooms had previously belonged to him. I looked at him across the courtroom. He did not look back. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. I had appeared in courtrooms before, during my years as an investigator. Depositions, evidence submissions. The occasional subpoena that required my physical presence rather than just my documentation. Those rooms had always seemed large in my memory, high-ceilinged and formal, weighted with their own institutional gravity. This one was functional and modest, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting, and a gallery that held perhaps 40 people, most of them locals who had followed the case in the bulletin, and had decided that a Tuesday morning in January was worth attending. I walked to the witness stand when my name was called, and sat down and looked at the middle distance in front of me, above the heads of the people in the gallery. I thought about something Ruth had said to me once, years ago, when I had been preparing to give testimony in a complicated fraud case, and had been rehearsing my answers at the kitchen table until she put her hand over mine and said, "The truth does not need a loud voice. It just needs to be said." I had not thought about that sentence in a long time. It came back to me now without effort, the way her voice always did in the moments when I needed it most. Percival took me through the foundation. First, my background, my 30 years as an insurance investigator, the professional methodology I had applied to the collection of the evidence on the USB drive. He was unhurried and precise, and I answered each question in the same register, building the record layer by layer the way you build a case file, starting with what can be verified and letting the weight accumulate on its own. Then Beckett's attorney stood up. He was a tall man in his late 40s, well-dressed in a way that communicated expense without ostentation, and he approached the witness stand with the particular forward momentum of someone who has identified the line of attack he intends to use and is confident in its effect. He had, I noted, a habit of pausing slightly before a question just long enough to create the impression that what followed was being arrived at in the moment, rather than prepared in advance. "Mr. Hale," he said, "isn't it true that your wife left your marriage due to your controlling behavior?" The gallery was quiet. I looked at him directly. I thought about the hospital corridor and Beckett's performance and the particular kind of silence I had used there, the silence of a man withholding something. That silence had been correct for that moment. This moment required something different. My wife, Ruth Hale, passed away from cancer in 2014, I said. She never left. A pause. She was 54 years old, I said. We had been married for 28 years. If you have documentation suggesting otherwise, I would be interested to see it. Beckett's attorney looked at his notes. He moved on. He tried 3 additional angles over the following 20 minutes. He suggested that my evidence collection constituted an invasion of privacy. Percival objected, and was sustained. The methods had been reviewed and approved as legally obtained. He suggested that my professional background created a bias toward constructing narratives that supported a predetermined conclusion. I told him that 30 years of constructing accurate case files was, in my experience, the opposite of bias. He suggested that my relationship with Calla made me an unreliable narrator of events involving her marriage. "Yes," I said. "She is my daughter. That is correct." He waited for more. I did not provide more. Percival rose for redirect. He moved through the evidence methodically, and without theater, the lock application logs the time-stamped entries showing 17 remote code changes, the device identifier matching Beckett's registered phone, He presented the footage from Silas Drummond's camera, pausing at the moment the porch light was extinguished, and addressed the court directly on the question of legality. Your Honor, the footage was obtained from a camera mounted on Mr. Drummond's private property, directed at an area visible from public space, in full compliance with Oregon Revised Statute 164.868. The footage is legally obtained, properly authenticated, and has been accepted into evidence without objection. He looked at the judge. What it shows is not ambiguous. He let the paused frame speak for itself for a moment, before continuing. The financial records came next. The $16,000 moved in increments from Cala's account, the premarital fund transfer, the restricted access credentials. Then the text messages read into the record, in the flat, unembellished voice of a man presenting facts rather than performing outrage. Then Nadine Forsyth's 2021 police report entered as pattern evidence under Oregon's coercive control statute. This is not a single incident, Percival said, addressing the judge. This is a methodology. Applied once, abandoned when legally challenged, and applied again 4 years later to a different person. The court has before it documentation of a deliberate and repeated pattern of coercive control. We are also filing simultaneously in civil court for full asset recovery, which will be addressed in a separate proceeding. He sat down. Cala was called after the lunch recess. She walked to the witness stand without looking at the defense table. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the wall above the gallery with the same level-forward attention she had used in the hotel room mirror that morning. She was wearing the clothes she had chosen for herself, and she looked exactly like what she was. A 29-year-old woman who had decided at some point between the hospital and this courtroom to stop making herself smaller. She testified for 40 minutes. She spoke in a voice that was measured and clear, describing events in sequence, providing dates when she had them and estimates when she did not, answering every question from both sides without evasion and without embellishment. It was nothing like the fragmented, trembling account she had given Officer Daltrey in the hospital corridor 2 months ago. That version had been the voice of someone still inside the thing she was describing. This version was the voice of someone who had gotten out, looked back, and understood the full shape of it. I watched Beckett while she spoke. I had been watching his face at intervals throughout the day, out of professional habit. More than anything else, the same reflex that had made me watch people across tables for 3 decades. During my own testimony, his expression had carried a residual quality of calculation, the look of a man still running contingencies, still assessing angles. During Percival's evidence presentation, that quality had begun to erode. By the lunch recess, it had been largely absent. Now, listening to Cala's voice fill the courtroom with the quiet, factual account of 2 years of her life, there was nothing left in his face that resembled strategy. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him, and they were flat and still, the way eyes are when the person behind them has stopped processing and is simply waiting for something to end. The judge called for order twice during Cala's testimony, not because of disruption, but because of the particular quality of silence that had settled over the gallery, the kind that requires active maintenance. When she stepped down from the stand, she did not look at Beckett. The judge asked the gallery to come to order. She looked down at the folder on her desk, thick-tabbed, marked with the case number along the spine, and opened it to the first page. She began to read. The judge's voice was even and unhurried, the way a voice becomes after years of delivering sentences in rooms that require precision over performance. I did not look at Beckett. I looked at Cala. She was sitting 2 rows ahead of me in the gallery, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had turned slightly toward the bench when the judge began speaking, and I could see the line of her jaw and the set of her shoulders. And I watched those instead of watching the man at the defense table, because what happened to him in the next few minutes was the court's business, and what happened to her was mine. The judge read the findings in sequence, working through each charge with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the record being created in this room would outlast everyone present in it. Coercive control under Oregon Revised Statute 163.732, enacted 2023. Sustained. The documentation presented by the prosecution established a deliberate and sustained pattern of behavior designed to restrict the autonomy, financial independence, and freedom of movement of the victim over a period not less than 18 months. The lock application logs the financial transfer records, the home security modifications, and the corroborating testimony of a prior victim demonstrating identical methodology across a 4-year interval taken together. They constituted evidence of systematic coercive control that the court found proven beyond reasonable doubt. Physical assault sustained. The medical documentation of Warren Hale's injuries, combined with the testimony of Officer Daltrey and the recording obtained on the night of the incident, established beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant had entered a private residence by force and caused physical injury to the complainant's father. Witness tampering sustained. The attempt to access Nadine Forsyth's 2021 police report through a third-party data service traced to a device associated with the defendant's legal team and conducted after Ms. Forsyth had been named on the witness list constituted interference with a protected witness under Oregon law. The judge paused. She looked up from the document for the first time since she had begun reading. The court sentences the defendant Beckett Crane to 8 years in the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections, with eligibility for review at the 60-month mark contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation progress. She looked at the defense table, which a permanent restraining order is hereby issued prohibiting any contact, direct or indirect, with Calla Hale or Warren Hale. Violation of this order will constitute a separate criminal offense. She set the document down. With respect to the civil matter filed concurrently in Deschutes County Circuit Court, the liquidation order for the defendant's assets, including the Ridgecrest Drive property, associated business holdings, and personal accounts, will proceed under the jurisdiction of that court. Distribution to the named complainants will be administered through the court-appointed trustee. She looked at the clerk. We are adjourned. The sound that followed was not loud. It was not the kind of moment that produces outbursts or demonstrations. It was instead a collective release of held breath, 40 people in a gallery who had been very still for a very long time, all of them returning at once to the ordinary business of breathing. I sat where I was for a moment. I had expected, when I thought about this moment over the preceding weeks, to feel something with more definition, relief perhaps, or the particular satisfaction that arrives at the end of a long and difficult piece of work. What I felt instead was a very large silence, like the silence after a storm has moved through and taken the wind with it, and the trees are still and the air is clean, and there is nothing left to brace against. Beckett was led from the defense table by a court officer. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Calla or at me or at anything in particular. He walked through the side door with the particular forward attention of a man who has already begun the internal work of separating himself from the room he is leaving. I did not watch him until he was gone. The corridor outside the courtroom was warmer than the room itself, and the light was different, less institutional. The kind of pale winter light that comes through tall windows and does not demand anything of the people standing in it. Nadine was there. She had not been in the gallery during the proceedings, her choice made through Percival, and one I had not questioned. She was standing near the far end of the corridor, her coat folded over one arm, and when Calla came through the doors, she looked up. They regarded each other for a moment across the width of the hallway. Two women who had arrived at the same point, by different routes and at different costs. And then Calla crossed the corridor and stood beside her. They did not speak. They did not embrace. They simply stood next to each other in the pale winter light, both of them looking at nothing in particular, occupying the same space in the way that people do when words are not the right instrument for what they are carrying. I watched them from a distance and did not approach. Silas was waiting near the main entrance, hat in hand, his canvas jacket buttoned against the cold that came through the glass doors every time someone pushed through them. He had been in the gallery for the full proceeding in the back row, and he had left quietly when the room began to empty. He looked standing there like a man who had set something down that he had been carrying for a long time, lighter, but also uncertain. The way you feel when a weight you have grown accustomed to is suddenly no longer there. He extended his hand when he saw me coming. I took it. The tremor was still there, fine and persistent, but his grip was firm. "Did we do right?" he asked. I held his hand for a moment. We did," I said. He nodded once slowly and looked down at the floor between us. Then he put his hat on and pushed through the main doors and walked out into the January cold, and I watched him go until he turned the corner and was no longer visible. Kala found me by the window at the end of the corridor. She did not say anything when she reached me. She stood beside me for a moment, looking out at the courthouse steps and the parking lot beyond, at the gray January sky and the thin line of the Cascades on the horizon, their peaks carrying the first serious snowfall of the new year. Then she reached over and took my hand. Her hand over mine, her fingers wrapping around the side of my palm, a quiet, certain grip, and she was the one who reached first. Not me. Her. I looked out the window at the gray sky and the snow on the mountains, and I thought about Ruth, and about the cabin, and about a knock on the door at 4 a.m. 2 months ago that had set all of this in motion, and about all the things that had to hold together in order for us to be standing here now, in a courthouse corridor in January, with the worst of it behind us. This was not an ending. I understood that clearly. There would be the civil proceedings and the slow work of recovery and all the ordinary days that would need to be built one at a time into something that resembled a life. None of that was finished. Most of it had not yet begun, but Kala's hand was in mine, and she had put it there herself, and outside the window the mountains were still standing, and that was enough to begin with. The garden was not much yet. A raised bed of rough-cut cedar along the south fence filled with soil I had turned by hand the week before. 6 tomato starts in terracotta pots along the back wall, still young enough that they needed staking. A row of garlic planted before the last frost that had come up crooked, but present, pushing through the dark earth in the particular determined way that things grow when the ground finally lets them. I had been out here since 6:30, working without urgency, in the way that I had forgotten was possible, the kind of morning work that does not have a deadline, that does not require documentation or precision, that asks nothing more of you than your presence and your hands. The air smelled of pine resin and wet soil and the particular clean quality that follows a spring rain. Behind the low fence at the property's edge, the ponderosa pines began the same trees, the same species, the same dense, dark architecture of branch and shadow that Kala had moved through on a November night 6 months ago. I had thought, when we first looked at this house, that the forest behind it might feel like the wrong thing to look at every morning. I had been prepared to find another property. It did not feel like the wrong thing. In the May morning light, with the sun coming through the upper branches in long, angled columns and the birds moving in the canopy overhead, the forest looked like what it had always been before that night, made it something else ordinary and beautiful and entirely indifferent to what human beings had done inside it. I stood at the fence for a moment and looked at it and let it be what it was. Kala had registered for the autumn semester in March. She had told me over dinner one evening without preamble the way she had begun telling me things directly, without the careful management that had governed every word she spoke in the years before. Psychology, she said. She had been thinking about it for some time. She wanted to understand certain things, and she had decided that understanding them formally in a structured way with people who had spent their careers mapping the territory was the right approach. I had not said much. I had asked which university. I had asked about the schedule. I had asked whether she needed anything from me to make the enrollment work. She had said she had it handled. I had said good. That had been the whole conversation, and it had been exactly the right length. Silas came every Sunday. He brought cornbread wrapped in a cloth, still warm from his oven, and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and did not require much conversation, which suited both of us. He had lost weight since November, not unhealthily, but in the way that people lose the weight of something they have been carrying for a long time. He asked about Kala each week and listened to the answer with the full, unhurried attention of someone for whom the question was not small talk. Nadine had sent a card from Portland in February and another in April. Both were brief. The first said she had found an apartment she liked and a therapist she trusted. The second said she had started running again in the mornings in a park near her building. She had signed both cards with her first name only, and both had arrived without a return address, which I understood and did not question. She was building something. She would let us know when it was built. I had not replaced the Rolex. I had not replaced the truck. In the weeks after the trial, I had thought about both practical considerations more than sentiment, the acknowledgement that a vehicle was eventually necessary, and a watch a reasonable convenience. But every time I arrived at the point of acting on either thought, I found that I did not want to. The absence of both had become in its own way a kind of record, a ledger entry I could read without opening a file. Everything that had been asked of that 6-month period reduced to 2 empty spaces in a life that was otherwise quietly filling back up. She gave me the box on the morning of my birthday before breakfast. It was wrapped in the page of a newspaper. Her idea, she said, practical, and she set it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup without ceremony. Inside was a watch, not expensive, not pretentious. A clean face, a simple leather strap, the kind of thing a man buys when he wants to know what time it is, rather than to announce anything to the room. I turned it over. On the case, back in small engraved letters, "You waited." Thank you. I stood at the kitchen table and held it for a moment without speaking. I thought about Ruth, who had given me a watch once with a note about a man who always knew what time it was, and who had understood better than I ever told her, that knowing what time it is matters far less than knowing what something is worth waiting for. She had said to me once in the last year of her illness that family was not something you were given. It was something you chose to protect day after day, regardless of the cost, and that the cost was never the point, because the thing you were protecting was always worth more than whatever you gave up to keep it. I had written it in a case file once years ago in the margin of a page because I did not want to forget it. I had not forgotten it. The morning moved around me in the way that good mornings do, slowly, without agenda, the light changing on the pine canopy as the sun climbed above the tree line. Then Kala called from inside the house, not calling for anything specific. Just the sound of my name, the way you call someone when you want them to come in for coffee when breakfast is close to ready. When the kitchen is warm and there is no particular reason to stay outside, except that outside is where you happen to be. I looked at the watch in my hand. I put it on my wrist for the first time. I walked back across the garden toward the open door, where the smell of coffee was already finding its way out into the morning air, and the light on the ponderosa pines was green and clean and still, and the house behind the door was not quiet the way it had been quiet for 11 years. It was full in the small and sufficient way that houses become full when the people inside them have finally stopped waiting and started living. Looking back now from this garden in May, I understand something I could not have articulated when this all began. I waited too long. I saw the signs in September and told myself I needed more time, more evidence, more certainty before I moved. What I actually needed was courage, the willingness to step forward before everything was perfect, before the case was airtight, before I was certain I would win. If you are watching someone you love disappear one quiet degree at a time, do not make my mistake. Do not wait until the damage is complete. Say something. Show up. The cost of waiting is always paid by the person you are trying to protect. Every grandpa stories worth telling carries the same lesson underneath it. Love is not a feeling you hold privately. It is a decision you make out loud in the cold, at great personal cost, when it would be easier to stay inside. This is a family story that required every person in it to choose more than once whether to act or to look away. Nadine chose to come forward despite everything she stood to lose. Silas chose to carry a box downtown instead of keeping his curtains closed. Kala chose to walk through a frozen forest toward a light she was not certain was real. These are not dramatic gestures. They are ordinary human decisions made under pressure, and they are the only things that ever truly change anything. I am not a man who speaks about faith easily, but I believe, as Ruth believed, that something larger than coincidence places the right people beside us at the right moment. In the middle of that November, when I had no truck, no watch, and nothing but a USB drive, and a daughter who had nearly been lost entirely, I felt that presence. Call it what you will. I call it grace, and I am grateful for it. Every grandpa story's truth I have ever carried comes down to this: the people worth protecting are always worth the cost. That does not change with time. It only becomes clearer. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this family story. If Warren's long silence, the months of waiting, the watch he sold, the evidence he built in the dark, stayed with you, I would genuinely like to know what you would have done in his place. Leave a comment below. Would you have acted sooner? Would you have trusted the legal process earlier? Would you have made the same choices he made when it mattered most? If this grandpa story's journey moved something in, you consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is built on the same conviction Warren carried through that November, that showing up for the people you love is never the wrong decision, regardless of what it costs you. A note offered in good faith. While this family story draws from real social themes, coercive control, the courage required to speak, the weight a family carries when one of its members is in danger, certain elements have been shaped and dramatized for the purpose of storytelling. It is a narrative built with care, not a documentary record. If this style of content is not what you are looking for, there is absolutely no pressure. Explore whatever serves you best. But if it is, I am very glad you found your way here.